So we have Kirstin Aschbacher coming up next. She has a really interesting perspective that she's going to bring to the table, and that is coming at data science from the point of view of psychology. So she currently works at Jawbone, and she's going to tell us about the future of wearables and changing human behavior. So the Holy Grail, please come share your knowledge with us.
Thanks for having me. It's really exciting to hear about everything that all of you are doing. So I want to talk today about the future of wearables and how that applies to behavior change. As she said, I'm a data scientist now at Jawbone, and I'm coming from a background in psychology and medicine. I'm also affiliated as an assistant professor at UCSF in the School of Medicine there. And you know, if you've ever spent some time in a hospital, or maybe you've read about sort of the spiraling healthcare costs, then it becomes very clear that one of the most important things we can do to improve our society is to make a shift from managing chronic disease to preventing it. And when it comes to preventing it, I think wearables is going to be an important part of that transformation. So to set the stage, let me just tell you a little bit about Jawbone's UP system. And it really goes far beyond sort of a simple hardware device to count your steps. So the UP is this integrated system where you have the band with multiple sensors integrated with an app, and also that app can integrate with many partner apps to bring in rich sources of data. And what we want to do with this data is to learn to understand our users over time so we can begin to offer them very tailored feedback. And that tailored feedback should ideally help motivate them to achieve the goals that are most important to them. And how we measure that has to be not only sort of in the short term, but really it has to be measured by sustained behavior change, because that's what translates into living longer, happier, healthier lives. So some of the sources of data that we get at Jawbone, we get data on your steps, your sleep. Users can input things about the food they're eating and their weight, their moods. And so part of my background that's a little bit unusual, I guess, as a data scientist is that I was trained as a clinical health psychologist. And so I'm really excited about these ideas of how we take knowledge that already exists, things that therapists know how to do with patients, and things that we know from basic neuroscience, and how do we bring that knowledge to an app, right? And to kind of help you envision this, I want to tell you a story about a patient I once worked with who is, I'll call him Andy. So Andy was in a terrible accident, and he developed a chronic pain disorder. And his doctor referred Andy to me because you know, Andy was in so much pain every day that he kept wanting to increase his medication dose, and his doctor was worried that he was going to develop opiate addiction. So what I did with Andy was we started tracking things on actually just a simple sheet of paper, no apps or anything, and we tracked his sleep, his activity, his mood, his pain level from day to day, and how much medication he was taking. And so Andy would come in, and what I would do is help him understand the interconnectedness between all of his data and his behaviors, and how that was shaping his pain. So, for example, we noticed that, you know, when Andy would go to bed earlier, he would have less pain the next day. But actually, even when you know what to do, it doesn't mean it's very easy to do it, right? And Andy had all kinds of reasons why it wasn't that easy for him to go to bed early. So then we had to work on, you know, some stress reduction techniques, and we worked on things like taking a walk for 15 minutes outside early in the morning so that Andy gets light in his eyes, and this helps regulate his circadian rhythms in ways that then make it easier for him to go to bed that night and get a sound night's sleep. And so this is what I mean by this whole process over time of showing him the interconnectedness of his behaviors. And through this process, in fact, he made really tremendous improvements, and his pain was reduced, and he was able to stick with sort of the safe dose of these medications. And so Andy's story kind of stuck with me as I went through my career, and I found myself at a later stage, running these clinical studies, maybe on 70 people, and it would take me, 2 or 3 years to get to the end of it. And, I was really interested in machine learning, and I started, diving deeper into that area, and I realized, I could probably automate some of that process of what I did with Andy, and we could scale that so that we could be reaching hundreds of thousands or even millions of people for a lower cost. And so for me, that was really some of the impetus that drove me to want to move to Jawbone. When I got there, what I wanted to start by understanding was, well, what really matters to our users? And it turned out that 84% of our users were actively trying to lose weight. And again, many of us know that if you want to lose weight, you should basically eat less and exercise more. But it's very hard to actually do that, right? Why don't we actually do it most of the time? And you can see sort of the magnitude of this problem by looking at how obesity rates have changed over the years. So this was back in 1990 when the prevalence of obesity in most states, ranged from 10 to 15%. And then in 1995, 2000, and as years progress, we reach 2014, where all of a sudden, roughly 1/3 of the U.S. is obese, and approximately 2/3 are struggling with being overweight or obese. And it's not just in the U.S. Really, this is a worldwide phenomenon. So worldwide obesity has more than doubled since 1980. In 2014, 1.9 billion adults were overweight or obese, and maybe for the first time in history, overweight and obesity is actually killing more people than underweight. Now, systems like the UP actually can make a difference. And so here's an example of a scientific review that's shown that the combination of group weight loss sessions and a system like the UP can result in something on the order of 14.5 pounds lost over 9 months. So, shifting gears, when I think about how to help Jawbone's users with their goal of weight loss, the way I think about that as a psychologist is we're trying to teach people to be better at self-regulation. Okay, but what is self-regulation? Well, it's the ability to act in your own long-term best interests, to align your behaviors with your deeper values, and to govern your actions. At Jawbone, oftentimes the way we think about what the UP system does is that we're tracking users' data, and then we're helping them understand it or make meaning out of it so that they can then shape their actions or align their actions with their values, right? But I find when you're trying to understand failures of self-regulation and what to do or how to help people through those failures, it helps to kind of open this black box of the brain and understand a little bit of the circuitry that underlies these failures. So, there's different circuits, some of which are regulated by reward and others by threats. And then you have your prefrontal cortex regions, which have these sort of inhibitory inputs and serve to inhibit reward drives or threats. And it's kind of the way that the interconnection of these systems plays out over time that becomes very important in when self-regulation fails us. And this framework is useful because it really helps you kind of categorize the different kinds of ways that self-regulation fails. And then you need different metrics different indicators and different responses, right? So one set of ways that self-regulation fails is that your reward systems are really stimulated in a way you weren't prepared to manage, right? And maybe you go to a party and you see some like really delicious food and you were hungry because you were restricting your diet. And that's one set of sort of threats. And another is kind of this emotional system where you're going through your day and you're really worn down by the effort of kind of doing all your work, enduring the mental challenge, showing up in the way you're trying to show up. And so by the time you get home, your resources are really pretty depleted. And that is one of the kind of risks or the windows of vulnerability for self-regulation. And here's a picture I like that is sort of about self-regulation in action. This comes from the set of scientific studies that was done at Stanford a while back on children, and they basically put children in a room with a marshmallow and said something like, well, if you can not eat this marshmallow for some period of time, when we come back, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And so there are these hysterical videos of all the things these little kids are trying to do to self-regulate. I'm not going to look at it, and they're going through all these emotions, and then, sometimes they give in, right? And all of us in some way still have that part of ourselves, right? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how that feeds into building tools and experiments for weight loss at Jawbone. So to start with, I looked at 72% of our users who do have a weight loss goal, and what we see is that in fact already many of them are successfully losing weight in our system. So concretely, 62% of our users will lose some weight by week 12, and about half of them will achieve 25% of their weight goal by week 12. So the next thing I wanted to do was to identify the potential levers that we could better target to optimize our system. And I basically built a multi-level model, sort of a regression multi-level model that first predicts the rate of weight change within a user and then determines which features or factors are most predictive of a greater rate of change or better weight loss. And I just ranked them here in terms of their feature importances. And things emerge that are pretty consistent with the literature and what we'd expect. If you start out heavier, you tend to lose weight a little bit faster. As we go on, I'm going to sort of highlight different levers and tell you a little bit more about how we could target them more specifically. But first, one thing that's really important, and I think just so critical in clinical research, is this truism that correlation is not causation. Okay, and so what I showed you is essentially an associational analysis, but what we then really need to do is run some randomized controlled trials, otherwise known as A/B tests, to determine if indeed these are causal and if we can actually modify them. So we have the capability to take our pool of participants and randomize them into a treatment group who gets our awesome intervention and a control group who gets, say, the status quo. And if randomization is working, as you probably know, then it's so important because we can be fairly sure that our 2 groups do not differ on all sort of measured and unmeasurable factors except for our treatment. And so then if we see this difference, we can say that our treatment was the likely cause. So in practice, one of the things we found is predictive of better weight loss is logging your food. So we said, well, can we encourage users to log their food? So we randomized people to a treatment group or a control group. And the treatment group got this notification and an associated insight in the app that says, it talks about the benefits of breakfast and prompts people to log. And for the control, here's where sort of experimental design is so important because you want to choose a control that really mirrors so many factors of your treatment group, but doesn't have that one key critical element. So here the control is still a food-related kind of insight, but there's no mention or prompting, no call to action to log your food. And indeed, what we saw was we were able to increase the likelihood that users would log their food in the app. And so then we said, well, that's great, except that unfortunately, we know that many people find logging their food pretty burdensome, and they don't really like to do it for too long a period. So what if we tried to target just those times when people are at the highest risk? And when we go back to this sort of neuroscience of self-regulation, one thing we see is that you could kind of think of self-regulation or willpower as this muscle, and it gets depleted when you're using it. So by the evening, after all the day's stressors, this is a period when people are more vulnerable to sort of snacking. And it's this evening snacking that in particular is predictive of weight gain. So we targeted this with an insight. And furthermore, when we target these things, there are a lot of subtleties about how you can use psychotherapeutic principles. So for example, I'll just kind of call them out. One is to normalize. So we say, you know what, it's not just you who struggles with this. Many people really are experience these temptations. Another is to counteract cognitive biases. So what I mean is that we're sort of hardwired to avoid things that make us feel bad, right? And one thing that makes you feel really bad is when you're trying to lose weight and you think you're healthy, and then you log your food and you go, oh my gosh, actually, I'm not nearly as healthy as I thought. I can't believe how many calories I've already eaten, and it's only 10 a.m. And this is forcing people to, confront these sort of uncomfortable truths. And then there's ways to language that so that it doesn't prompt this avoidance response. You can say things like, we understand, it's really easy to forget what you've already eaten, right? And you should enjoy what you eat, but also log it, and then that's going to help you working with these cravings, right? We're promoting self-monitoring, so there's always the call to action, a very specifically defined action of logging your food. We reduce barriers by providing a link, so we don't make people search through the app. We don't risk problems with discoverability. And most importantly, when you had an intention and you were unable to follow through, especially with weight, many people experience shame, right? And what do you do when you experience shame? You want to hide. You want to avoid it. You want to do anything you can not to tell people about it. And so the last thing you want to do is log the fact that you just ate a cupcake, right? And what's the antidote for shame? It's empathy, right? So it's really important to convey that empathy. And so when we ran that experiment, I can tell you there were some interesting results. As we expected, we saw that we were successful increasing the likelihood people would log their snacks in the evening. But then I also saw that between the hours that we were running the experiment, the treatment group had a small but significant increase in the number of calories they logged. And as a data scientist, you're like, wait a minute, so does this mean the treatment is good or bad? Because in general, we know logging fewer calories is associated with better weight loss, and here our intervention is somewhat increasing the calories. And so here, it's useful to distinguish, as psychologists do, between the ground truth of what your behavior really is and the way you self-report it to other people, right? So here's an example of a scientific study about how people self-report what they've eaten. And what they found in this study, they basically classified people according to whether the number of calories per day that people were reporting was sort of plausible based on, how many calories a normal person would need to eat. And from that, they got this group that they called the underreporters. And what they found was that people were underreporting actually way more. And not only that, they're more concerned about their weight, and they're more likely to be restricting what they eat. And actually, in neuroscience studies, people who restrict what they eat can have more of sort of reward activation when they finally do eat something, say, high in sugar and fat. And so what I learned from kind of piecing together all those pieces of the literature is that actually it's probably a good thing that the treatment group is reporting a slight increase in the amount of calories. It probably means the experiment is working because we want those people who are underreporters to be able and comfortable to log what they're eating, to get that feedback, and to do it in a healthy way. The last part of this I want to talk about is that when you're trying to predict weight loss over time or any sort of sustained behavior change, one way it's different from, say, optimizing a click-through rate is that you've got to measure people over months, right? And you can imagine that if we follow people for months and only 50% of our users actually input weight data towards the end of that period, we potentially have a problem, because in order for randomization to work, you need to analyze everybody who was randomized, or you need some process for imputing the missing data. And then you have this problem of diluting your effects, right? So one thing we were able to do to try to counteract that is conduct this experiment and determine that we could use our notification system and encourage users to track their weight. So going back to that regression analysis of sort of the levers that seem to be associated with weight loss, now I want to talk about how we take those data insights and feed them back into the product. So for example, we found that if a user had set their weight goal several months ago, that user was much less likely to lose weight than someone who'd set their goal a week ago. Which makes sense, right? It's sort of a behavioral indication of intentionality or present motivation. And so based on that, then we sent them this insight, which basically says, hey, people are more likely to reach their goals when your goal feels attainable. So if you're aiming to lose 20 pounds, why don't you try setting a goal to 5 pounds? And if you get there, you can always set a new one. So we're prompting people, again, to reinforce their sort of motivation, their intentionality around their goal and make it attainable. And next, sort of some of the findings that emerged was that a higher food score, which is basically a metric Jawbone's developed to indicate better food quality, and fewer calories per meal were associated with better weight loss. So, maybe your first impression might be, okay, well, we could send people an insight that says, hey, in the last week, your food score went down and your calories per meal went up. Those put you at risk for weight gain. But now, we have to think this through a little bit from the user experience perspective. So if you're a user, you're trying to lose weight, maybe you're feeling kind of hungry, you go to a party and it's your friend's birthday and she hands you this piece of cake and you say, oh, no, thank you. And then, she says something like, well, this is really great cake, it's from the best place. And before you know it, you're looking at it and then you eat it. And now maybe you have this realization, this wasn't what I wanted to do. This wasn't how I wanted to behave. And for many people, when that happens, they experience, again, this kind of feeling of shame and wanting to avoid definitely logging that cake in the app, right? And so if at that moment, or maybe a few days later, that person opens the app and they were to see that insight where you said, hey, your food score went down and your calories per meal went up, that insight might actually not be very motivating for them. So what can you do instead? Well, you can focus on the positive instead of the negative, and you can make it very specific. Because for most of us, maybe hearing about average calories per meal, we might not be quite sure how that translates into action. If our lunch is in front of us, what does that really mean? On the other hand, you can tell someone something about, like, basically eating more vegetables, and that's a way to increase your food score, decrease your calories, but it's much more specific and sort of easy to understand. But another thing we found is that when we recommend things like that to our users, first of all, it doesn't feel very personalized. So it's not maintaining this intelligent system. And second of all, people come back with this feedback. I hate avocados. I'm allergic to avocados, right? And one of the worst things we found we can do is recommend specific foods, right? So the approach I took was I took our food database where users basically can enter anything they want and developed the score that can tell users about the percentage of their meals that contain vegetables and also contains a string so we can tell them, we can basically say, hey, you're already doing something right. Can you do more of this? You know, eat more of this thing you already like. And that has been fairly successful in that we don't get the same kind of negative feedback. So in conclusion, to me, part of the future of wearables is really about targeting behavior change to help people live longer, healthier, happier lives. And in order to do that, it's really about this sort of integrated system of hardware and sensors and the app, and most importantly, kind of this integrating this psychological intelligence so that you feel like you're building a relationship with your wearables and that they know you. You know, what I want to emphasize is that I think the future of wearables is not only about hardware and machine learning, but this understanding, this relationship. And from that perspective, psychologists in neuroscience can really have a lot of valuable content knowledge that they can bring in as data scientists. So the future, in my opinion, is more health than fitness, more prevention than disease, and ultimately about behavior change. Thank you. Looks like we have some time for questions. Yeah?
That's one effective way to get people to do things like lose weight is to get them to publicly announce that they're trying to lose weight. And so they feel a sense of social pressure because they've told their friends they're doing that to continue. Mm-hmm. Do you find that's true? Have you encountered this effect at all? Do you think that's legitimate?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's effective in the short run, but I would not recommend it in the long run because I think, you know, one unfortunate thing about weight loss is many people regain the weight. And so a good intervention has to instill like the foundation to sustain that behavior. And part of that has to be, you know, it can't be sort of social shame that sustains that.
I'm kind of curious if have you guys looked at kind of the effect of like a person's social network on you know, being healthy? Because I imagine I feel like, you know, as a former smoker, right, that like I used to smoke because all my friends smoked, and I quit, you know, at some point because, you know, it's easy to quit in California because nobody smokes. Like, have you guys seen any interesting results in that field?
So I definitely know in the psychological literature that social networks have an impact on weight loss. At Jawbone specifically, one of the tools or features we have in the app is called duels. So you can connect with friends, and then you can duel your friend, or sometimes we've done character duels, and those are really successful, I think, in leveraging a sense of competition and, you know, social factors, but like in a healthier way. Yeah.
Do you have any data on the extent that
Asking idiotic question about Pokemon Go. We were all thinking it. Is Pokemon Go making people healthier over like the last 2 or 3 weeks?
So I think Brian Wilt from Jawbone has published or will shortly publish a blog specifically talking about that. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much.